and you spend all your time talking to all the negative people that are not experiencing anything good in their life, and you wonder why you always have a negative attitude, right? Because you haven't changed your scenery. You want God to do something new in your life, and you're talking to the same old people. The best thing that you can do to have God do something new is get rid of the old.
Welcome to the worldwide outreach of Skillman Church of Christ in Dallas, where we invite you to connect, grow, serve, and go. Now with today's message, here's Joel Sanchez.
So for the last couple of weeks, almost since we started the year, I've been preaching to you about this whole concept and this idea that God wants to finish the work that He has started in you. And today, as I wrap up the series, I want to spend some time doing a little bit of a recap for you about where we've been and the points that we have made and the things that we have touched on, and kind of conclude, wrap it up. We started off a couple of weeks ago in January in Jeremiah chapter 18, where Jeremiah calls the potter to go down, where God tells Jeremiah to go down to the potter's house. And there's one thing that strikes me from that whole entire text in Jeremiah chapter 18, and that is that when Jeremiah stands and looks at what the potter is doing, it says that the vessel that the potter was making was marred or was destroyed in the hands of the potter. And so the potter took that lump of clay, and it says in Jeremiah 18 that he remade it into a vessel as he best saw fit. And so one of the things that I want you to remember from that text, one of the things that I want you to remind yourself of that story, is to stop modeling and patterning your life after other people and other things, and spend some time figuring out who is it that God wants you to be. I think you and I get into a lot of trouble, and we struggle in our lives because we often want to model our lives after our neighbor, or I want to model my life after my parents, or I want to model my life after my coworker, or I want to model my life after a friend. And the problem is that your life and their life are not the same. Your experiences and their experiences are not the same. And we kind of get in trouble whenever you are trying to fit a mold that somebody else has created for you, instead of deciding and determining what is the mold that God has for you. The beauty of that text and the beauty of that scripture is that ultimately God knows best who you're supposed to be. And the more time you spend with God, the more of an idea and the more of an identity you will get into the person that God is calling you to be. So stop looking at the world and stop looking at other people's timeline for how you think your life needs to be turning out. Stop looking at what other people are doing and buying and saying in order to determine what you're going to do and what you're going to buy and what you're going to say. The model that God has for you and the shape that God has for you is unique to you and cannot be copied by somebody else. And the more you try to copy somebody else's shape, and the more you try to copy somebody else's model, the more dissatisfied you are going to be with the final product, because ultimately the final product that you want is not the one that you're looking at in someone else, it's the one that God has for you. And if you think that peer pressure ends when you're 16, right? I thought when I was in elementary school and when I was in high school, I said, it's going to be so great when I finally become an adult, because I'm just going to be my own person, and I'm not going to care what other people think, and I'm not going to care what other people say. It's going to be over. Like right now, when you're in high school, you ever remember those days where everything mattered, right? Where you sat at the cafeteria table mattered, and the brand name that your sneakers had mattered, and your clothes mattered, and your sweatshirt mattered, and who your friends were mattered, and where in the school you hung out with mattered, because the cool kids hung out here and the kids that weren't popular hung out on the other side, and your whole entire life was consumed with being with the right people and wearing the right things and being in the right crowd. And I said to myself, I can't wait. I can't wait until I get out of high school and I go to college, and you just create your own identity, and what other people say doesn't matter, and peer pressure doesn't matter, and I just live my own life. And you realize that even as an adult, you still have that tendency to look at somebody else and say, I want their life. you look at somebody else and you say, I want their job. I want their career. I want their husband. I want their wife. I want their kids. I want their house. I want their car. I want what they have. And you think, and your kids, if you have kids that are in that stage, right, they come home and they're telling you about the peer pressure that they're experiencing, or your grandkids are telling you about the peer pressure that and what do you tell them? Well, honey, it doesn't matter what they're saying about you. You should not care about that. You just live your own life and you do what you're supposed to do, and don't you worry about what those people say. Right? That's what you tell them, right? And it doesn't matter, right? Because God loves you just the way you are. You don't have to do what other people say. You just do what's in your pretty little heart. And you only wish that you could give that same advice to yourself. That you could sit yourself down and say, it doesn't matter what they say, and it doesn't matter how far they've gotten, and it doesn't matter that they have what you want, and it doesn't matter that they are where you want to be. Ultimately, what matters is that I'm going to submit myself to God in this time in my life for God to do what I want him to do in me. And it doesn't matter that my neighbor is a little bit more ahead of me. And it doesn't matter that they seem to have it more together than I do. And I'm not going to say, well, they have it all together, but I bet you it's all falling apart. Because the problem is you never see whether it's all falling apart or not. So that never makes you feel better. And even when you see that it's all falling apart, you shouldn't feel good about that, right? You shouldn't be like, oh, you see, I knew it. They look like they have it all together, but it's not all together. You shouldn't feel good about that. Instead, you should spend some time saying, God, what is the best fit for me right now in this time in my life, in this season of my life? That's the first thing that I want you to take away from this series. And here's the second thing, and I told you this early on in that story in Mark chapter 8 about the fact that Mark chapter 6 and 7 and 8, Jesus is walking around Gentile territory, and the Gentiles were the outsiders, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were the insiders. And so the teachers of the law and the Pharisees were the folks that were supposed to get it, and they were the folks that were supposed to embrace the Messiah because they knew and they had read about the way that he was going to come, and they had read the prophecy. And when Jesus comes, if they had read their book again, if they had gone and reviewed and pulled out the cliff notes to the Bible, they would have seen that Jesus met all the characteristics and all the criteria for how the Messiah was going to come. If they had only been reading, they would have gotten it. But when you read all throughout the New Testament and all throughout the Gospels, you understand that the insiders didn't get it and the outsiders didn't get it. The outsiders, the Gentiles, the people that were not supposed to be experiencing transformation are the people that are actually experiencing transformation. And I told you that if Jesus were to come back today and hang out with us, we would be the insiders. We would be the ones that wouldn't get it. And we would be the ones that would be stuck not experiencing the miracle. Let me tell you what I think number 2 is a big obstacle to your transformation. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to your transformation and to your change is the fact that nobody else around you is experiencing it. Does that make sense? Like when you are in a community, when you are in a group of people that are experiencing change and that are experiencing transformation, and God is doing something in their life and God is moving in their life, and they're constantly witnessing and testifying about what God is doing and how God is changing them and how God is transforming them and all the good things that God is doing, right? When you're constantly around those people, you've got 2 choices, right? The first choice is, I want what they want, right? I want to experience what they're experiencing because they're constantly talking about all the things that God is doing and all the things that God is fixing and all the things that God is finishing. And they're constantly talking about all the things that God is doing in their life and the doors that God is opening and the progress that they're making. I want to hang out with those people, and I want to know what is it that God is working in their life and how I can get some of what they're getting. That's option 1. But there are some people who, whenever they get around people who are experiencing transformation, it highlights the fact that that's not happening in their life, and so they walk away from that community. And so let me ask you a question. Let me ask us a question. We as a church, if somebody were to walk in and be a part of this church, Are we the kind of people that are constantly talking about what God is doing in our lives? If people were to walk into this community, would they get a sense that God is alive and well, and that God is changing people, and that God is transforming people based on what we say, not based on what we preach, not based on what we sing? I'm not talking to you about the ministries that God is moving. I'm not talking to you about the programs, because we talk a lot about the programs that we do in this church and what the youth is doing and the children are doing and what the adults are doing and what the ladies are doing. And we talk a lot about the programs, but I'm not talking to you about the program. I'm talking to you that if people were to walk into this church, would they get a sense not that God is moving through the program, but that God is moving through the people? Would they get a sense from how they hear us talking and interacting over coffee and in our Bible classes that God is actually moving in your life? If they were to walk in looking for God to not looking for a program, not looking for a preacher, not looking for a song, not looking for a worship team, not looking for children's church, if they were to walk in through the door, on top of the fact that we have a program, will we have a transformation that we would be able to sell them based on what we are saying? A lot of times the biggest obstacle that you have to transformation is the fact that nobody around you is experiencing it. And so you feel like, well, I'm just going to live in the status quo. Because isn't it weird to be the odd person in the group when everybody's talking superficially and you want to talk about the deep things that God is doing in your life, but everybody at Life Group is still talking about the game and the Olympics and what happened and how crazy was that? Everybody's talking about the weather and how it's so cold and how it's so hot and how it's so not cold and how it's so mild and how it's so windy, because we love to talk about that. And 45 minutes into your Life Group, everybody's still talking about the weather and everybody's still talking about the Olympics, and you want to talk about the deep things that are happening in your life and what God is doing and what you're struggling with, but nobody else is talking about it, so you don't want to be the weird spiritual person. Right? Ever felt that in a conversation? Like, I wish we could go deeper. I wish there was an avenue. I wish somebody would create a space where I could really talk about what is happening in my life, but I guess we're just going to talk about the weather at this group today. Well, just log on to the Weather Channel. I can give you the weather. It's nice in California. It's snowing everywhere else in the world. And Dallas is going to be 75 today and 32 tomorrow. This weather update is brought to you by Skillman Church, right? Like, that's the weather. We don't need to talk about it for 45 minutes, right? We've never had more access to the weather, and yet we keep on talking about, you know what it's going to be tomorrow? Yeah, I do. I've got it on my phone. But thank you for trying to make small talk. Number 3, Jesus leads the blind man outside of the village. I think for 2 reasons. Number 1, because he wants a change of scenery. Because when the people bring him to Jesus, there is purportedly a group of people that are around him, and Jesus wants to talk to him, and Jesus wants to do something in your life. If you want transformation to happen, your scenery is going to have to change, and some of the people that are around you are going to have to change, and you're going to have to replace some of the people in your life that are not experiencing transformation with people in your life that are experiencing transformation. You want the good peer pressure, not the bad peer pressure. I need people in my life that are being transformed, and I need people in my life that are being changed. I need to talk to other preachers and other pastors and other leaders who are seeing God do awesome things in their church, because I need to be equipped and I need to be empowered and I need to be given faith that God actually works and that God actually moves. I can't surround myself constantly with preachers and pastors and church leaders that are talking about how bad the church is and how bad church members are and how struggle it is to be in ministry and how difficult and painful it is. I need to surround myself with people that are doing big things for God and listen to what they are doing, because whenever I listen to what they are doing and what God is doing in their church, I get hope and I get faith and I get reassurance that maybe whatever God is doing in their church, God can also do in this church, and I get excited and I get new life and I get new energy. Stop talking to all your friends that have a bad marriage, because they're only giving you bad marriage advice. You get it? Ooh, let me tell you about my husband. Ooh, girl, let me tell you about mine. Right? Man, my wife, man, she's just crazy, man. Oh, you think your wife is crazy? Let me tell you about my wife, man. She is just nuts. Why? And you spend all your time talking to all the negative people that are not experiencing anything good in their life, and you wonder why you always have a negative attitude, right? Because you haven't changed your scenery. You want God to do something new in your life, and you're talking to the same old people. The best thing that you can do to have God do something new is get rid of the old. So why don't you start talking to people that have a good marriage and see what they have to say? Why don't you start talking to people that are experiencing God work in their life and see what they have to say? Why don't you start talking to your friends that are actually going to church on a regular basis and listening to the word? Why don't you start talking to them and going to them for advice instead of going to all the crazies that can't give you a verse, right? You know who you're talking about, and you know who I'm talking about, right? Why don't you go to people that will give you a word, capital W, instead of people that will give you a word, small w, right? There's a big difference. You got to change your scenery. You got to change who you hang out with. You got to change who you listen to and who you spend time with if you actually want God to change things in your life. God takes the blind man and he leads them outside of the village because he needs a change of scenery. Number 3, 6, I don't know what number I'm on, but number something. Note to self, number stuff in your manuscript, right? When Jesus takes the man outside of the village, he gets some spit. And if you remember, and if you were here that Sunday, back in that day, I don't know this for a fact, I've read it in a couple of commentaries, so it must be right. Back in that day, spit was considered to have some sort of medicinal purpose to it, right? So you complain about that colonoscopy. Back in the day, right? It's just I'm not feeling so well, my eyes are a little bit, I know exactly what to do. Just stand right there, right? And it's interesting that Jesus does that very same thing. He takes some spit and he rubs it on the man's eyes. And here's what I want you to learn from that. That a lot of times the change and the transformation that you want in your life comes in much simpler ways than you thought. And here's what I mean. I know that you think that if you only had a little bit more money, you would be able to accomplish and you would be able to change and live a better life. I know that. How many people feel that way? If I just had a little bit more money, don't lie. These people are like, oh no, if I just a little bit, I don't want a lot. If I just had a little bit more money, gee, my life, man, would just be so much better. And you just wonder and you say, if I just go to therapy, every week instead of once a month, I know that I would get better. If I just tried these mind, thought exercises, if I just tried, and you have a list of all these things that you wanted, if I just go see a counselor and an advisor, and if I just get a team of people together, and if I just Google this until you ever Googled something up until the point that you've clicked on every single thing that has remotely, like when you go back to your history and you Google it again, it's not in blue anymore, it's in that like other shaded color, like, yeah, I read that, and then you page 8, and you're like, yep, read that, right? And you've tried you're like, let me just try Chrome, let me just see if that will work, let me try on Safari, if I get, they're all the same, right? Have you tried the simple solution? The one where you get on your knees and you're just like, God, would you help me? It's not fancy, okay? Let me warn you, it's not fancy, and by the way, it's not going to cost you anything. It's free. You tried that solution? Now, it's going to cost you some time, and it's going to cost you some pain, and it's going to cost you some energy, but it won't cost you a dime. Just some simple spit is going to get you some vision. Do you think it's beneath you? Do you imagine Jesus spits in his hand, about to put it in the guy's eye? Whoa, 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 easy there, yeah. No, I've got this germ thing going on. Can you get some hand sanitizer, right? And just I don't want that, right? And you want to know why whenever people, you ever heard that expression, somebody hit rock bottom, right? And once you hit rock bottom, there's no way to go but up, right? Because part of the reason why people who hit rock bottom, the only way that they have and the only next move is up, is because they are done trying it on their strength and they finally start relying on God's strength. And I'm not going to get into it now, but I'll get into it just a little bit later. But sometimes the biggest problem that you and I have with experiencing change in our lives is all the options that we have to change. That make sense? The biggest obstacle and the biggest problems that you have for change is all the options. Well, I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do the other thing, or maybe this will work, or maybe I'll try this thing, or maybe this other thing will work. And sometimes the best place to be, sometimes the best place that you can be spiritually is when you have no options. Because there's a peace that comes over you and you say, okay, it's my last chip. And it's scary. It's very scary, but there's a sense of peace where you're just like, this is it. I'm putting it on the table. It's my last card. I either win or I lose, and I'm freed. I don't have 2 more cards. I don't have 2 more chips. I don't have anything else. This is it. When you've got nothing to lose, that's when faith shines. And the last and final point that I want you to remember from that, change is a process. You don't like it, I don't like it. I wish change was instantaneous. I wish it happened just like that. I wish I could go to a church service and listen to a preacher and then just change. Do you want to know how many times you and I have been in church and listened to a sermon and been moved to tears? To tears. I'm not talking about like just like the little tear, like, just the bear that you're just like, that you can just kind of just put your hand kind of over like that, and somebody won't see that you're crying. You're, these allergies, right? I'm talking about like the tears, like the ones that just stream down. How many times you've been in a church service and just you listen to a worship song and just the tears, man. And 2 days later, it's just like nothing happened, right? And you're like, let me just play that song again. Let me just listen to the sermon again, and nothing happens. Because change is a process. And it's going to take time. But eventually, God shows up, and God does something in your life. I want to wrap up Genesis, and I want to wrap up Jacob with you today. And I'm going to be really quick, because I just have one major point that I want to make from that. If you remember from last week, Jacob gets into a little bit of trouble with his brother. He decides to do the only thing that he knows how to do whenever he gets into trouble, and that is to run. And in the midst of running away to hang out with his uncle, it says in Genesis chapter 28, verse 13, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And I spent some time last week telling you God's mercy and God's grace, that even when Jacob is running away from God, and even when Jacob is deep in the midst of his sin, God shows up and God says, I will not leave you until I have finished what I have promised to do in you. And so Jacob leaves. And he goes and he hangs out with his uncle Laban. Genesis 28:16, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And 29:1, then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. So I'm going to try to summarize exactly what it is that happens with Jacob and take you to sort of the middle end of the story. Jacob goes to meet with his uncle Laban, and while he's there, he meets a girl, because every story starts that way, and he falls in love with that girl, and he goes to his uncle. And by the way, this is Bible time, so this is perfectly acceptable. Technically, it is somewhat of his cousin, but whatever, you do what you got to do. And so he goes to his uncle. They've never met before. It's perfectly fine, okay? So he goes to his uncle Laban, and he says, I see you're a girl there, your daughter, Rachel, and she's pretty, and I wonder if I could, have her as a wife. And Laban says, yes, if you will work for me for 7 years. And I love this. Like, if you want a good line, like if you're still in the Valentine's Day mood, you got to go to Genesis for it, because Laban tells Jacob, you can have her if you work for me for 7 years. And the text says that Jacob worked for Rachel for 7 years, but it seemed like a short time because he loved her. Oh, it's just warm. It's just, like, it's just, it doesn't matter. 7 years is like a day for you, Rachel. Like, oh. That's like a Valentine's Day story right there. And so here's what happens, right? With the love story, it comes time for the wedding night, and I guess that Jacob, kind of just got a little bit carried away at the punch bar, and when he wakes up he had a lot of communion that Sunday. When he wakes up the next morning, it's grape juice, don't try it next week. When he wakes up the next morning, he finds out that instead of Rachel, he got Leah, her sister. And as you could imagine, he's not very happy about this. And so he confronts Laban, and Laban is like, oh, my bad. That's kind of, Laban is just like, oh, I forgot to tell you, it's not our custom to marry our youngest daughter first. We usually marry our oldest daughter. I didn't tell you that? No, are you sure? Oh, I'm sorry. There was just a big, huge misunderstanding. You can have Rachel, you just got to work for me for another 7 years, right? And Jacob is like, okay. And so he works, and now he's got Rachel and he's got Leah. And it's interesting, we don't have time to get into it, but isn't it interesting that the guy that is a deceiver ends up getting deceived? And that was part of what he had to go through in order for God to work in his life. So they're happily hanging out there, him and his 2 wives. And Jacob, because he is a deceiver, finds a way to trick Laban. And so Jacob is growing in wealth at Laban's expense. And Laban's kids all of a sudden realize that this is happening, that Jacob is getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and that Laban is getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And so Jacob finds out that Laban finds out, and when Jacob finds out that Laban finds out, guess what Jacob does? He sits down with Laban and has an honorable conversation with him about what has been going on. No. He runs, right? He's like, okay, it's time to pack up and leave. And Laban finds out that Jacob is on the run. It says in Genesis 31:22, on the 3rd day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Tell the person next to you, it wasn't his season. Tell them so they can hear it. It wasn't his season. I remember when I was a kid, I got in trouble once. I'd get in trouble, and most of the times my mother could deal with it, right? My father did not spend a lot of time at home. My father would leave at about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, and he would be back at 10, 11, midnight, 7 days a week. That was his schedule. 95% of the time when I got in trouble at home, my mother would deal with it accordingly in that moment. Then there were those days when the alignment of the planets combined with what I had done, which in my view was not that bad, and my mother's temper and her day and everything just did not quite jive together. And I would get into some sort of trouble, and my mother would utter these words: "Wait until your father gets home." Let me explain to you a little bit about what that meant in my home. My father was not a race car driver. My father was not an actor. My father was not a highly paid businessman. My father was a blue-collar, working-class man who worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. Seemed like a week. When this gentleman arrived at his home, he didn't want to be confronted with misbehaving children. He wanted to arrive to a happy house, a house with children who were asleep and quiet, who had been obedient all day, who would greet him with a warm kiss and say, "Hello, Father, we are so glad you're home." Instead, on that day, he would be greeted with a child pretending to be asleep and a wife who was highly upset. Laban goes after Jacob, and God intervenes in Laban's pursuit and says, "Don't talk to him. Don't say anything to him, good or bad." You want to know why? Because it wasn't his season. God said, "I'm going to deal with him." It's when my mother said, "I'm taking my hands off of you. I'm going to wait until, because your father's going to deal." And when my father dealt with me, there was usually 99% of the time, it was just a very stern conversation with a lot of yes, sir, no, sir, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, sir, no, sir. But every once in a while, and I didn't know when, let's just say that it got a little bit physical in my house. Okay? I'm not arguing for or against, you can do whatever you want with your kids. I'm telling you what they did with me. Okay? I'm not telling you I'm just telling you what happened with me. And this isn't therapy. I'm not kind of unloading on you. It's my life, okay? I got over it. I moved on. You know that sometimes you want to change and it's not your time and it's not your season? Because there's still things that God has to work out in your life, and you just want to get to the other side, and yet you keep on being stuck. It's not your time and it's not your season. And let me also say this to you: if you're sitting here and you like to fix people, and I'm talking to myself, one of the biggest things that I'm learning this year, that sometimes it's not your season. That sometimes as a spiritual leader, I see things in your life that are crystal clear to me, and you don't see them. And I pour my life into trying to get you to change and trying to get you to see something and trying to get you to understand something, but it's not your season. And regardless of what I do, and regardless of how I preach, and regardless of the passion, and regardless of how I call you, it's not your season, it's not your time, and it's not going to work. And that is so frustrating when you see something in somebody's life, when you see somebody going down a path and you throw yourself in the middle of the rails and because you want to save them it's not their season. Leave them alone. Go back, spend some time praying to God that it would be their time. And you know what? Maybe it's not her season yet. Maybe it's not his season yet. And you are trying to bring about something in there. You're trying to be Laban. I'm going to go after him. And he and I are going to have a little talk. And God tells Laban, no, listen, you stop, because he and I are going to have a little talk. And I've got a whole thing planned. And if you get in the way of what I'm trying to do, you're going to ruin it. It is not his season yet. It is not his time yet. And when it is, I'm going to grab a hold of him and he's going to grab a hold of me, and it's going to be a totally different thing. Some of you need to let go of people that you have been begging to change for 2 months, for 6 years, for 20 years. You have got to let them go. It is not their season. It is not their time. God is not going to do it yet. They have to go through some things in their life, and every time you step in and save them, and every time you step in and stop them, you are stopping the work that God is doing in their life. Let them go. Leave them alone. It is not their time. And when it is their time, you will know it, and so will they. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, so Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. The man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name, Jacob?" He answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Then Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Genesis 32:26. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go until you bless me." You want to know when you're ready for change? You want to know when you're ready to have God do big things in your life? It's not when you get all emotional and teary-eyed over a sermon or over a song. It's when you're willing to let go of everything in your life, and you're willing to go back like Jacob did and face the past. And you're willing to hold on to God and no one else and say, "Until you bless me, I will not let you go." That type of determination, it's not emotional, it's not about getting to you. That type of absolute determination, when you have that, that's when you know. So if you're concerned, right, because you're like, God, I've been trying to change for just this whole entire last year. God, I've been trying to change. God, the past 5 years, God, the past 10 years, I have struggled so much to change. Can I ask you to spend some time telling God, God, will you bring me to that place where I am willing to just hold on to you, let go of everything and everyone else, and be able to say, until you bless me, until you change me, until you work in me, I will not let you go. And for somebody else in your life that you have been trying to change this last year, 10 years, an entire lifetime, will you just pray this prayer this week? God, I understand it may not be their season, but I pray that soon it will. And I pray that when their season comes, I will be there to walk them through it. And I will be there to encourage them and to love them. But God, until that time, help me not to get frustrated because they're not changing. Help me not to get frustrated because I want them to be in my season, but they're not in my season. They're in their season. And let them go. And let God do in them what he's going to do. And say, God, will you meet them one day? And will you wrestle with them? And will you struggle with them? And will you make them hold on to you until you bless them? And will you give me the blessing of seeing that? So that I can know that all my prayers were answered. Their time came. As our elders come around the room, and as we continue to worship God in song, if you would like for us to pray for you, we would love to do that. If today is your season and you would like to get to know more about God, get to know more about Christ and the death that he died that brings you salvation, if you would like to be baptized today, we would like to extend that invitation to you. Today is your season. Let's sing.
Let's stand together. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchase of God. Born of his Spirit, washed in his blood.